So speaking of Roe v. Wade, what was it like? What does Supreme Court overturning do? I don't even really know like what it was. I remember because it's not in the Constitution, but like in the
Correct.
70s or whatever, that Supreme Court at the time said it was constitutional.
So the court, I have tremendous respect for the Supreme Court. I actually got to watch oral arguments just about a year before COVID hit. I was in Washington D.C. and we did the rigmarole to randomly show up to a case being argued before the Supreme Court. So like regardless of any decisions or whatever, I just have tremendous respect for the court and its role in our republic. So the court has to do they're the academic angle on all this. Like they're looking at like case law, precedent, not just the Constitution, but they're the historical lens like we should look to during like tumultuous times. Like they can be like a rock in the center of chaos and uncertainty in the political realm. The court we should do absolutely everything we can to keep the court insulated from politics because they're the ones looking back and trying to understand the past and reconcile the future, or the present rather, with the past for the benefit of the future. So the Roe decision came about, like abortion had been like litigated, some states had it legalized. I think there probably weren't a ton of laws in the books for states where it was legal. I don't think any states were outwardly trying to legalize it. I could be wrong about that, but certainly states were trying to restrict access to abortion before 73. And so that's when the Roe decision made its way to the court, and the court takes on cases that it thinks will help settle big debates like in American life. And so what they found was that a majority of the court found that a woman's right to privacy, as understood through prior case law found in the 14th Amendment, which is actually a post-Civil War amendment about slavery. If you read the text of it, it describes the right to privacy and due protection from interference. Their reading of the 14th Amendment and other decisions they'd made up until that point that incorporated the 14th Amendment, they found that a majority, even though they disagreed on some of the logic, that it offered women protection to choose an abortion. But they also had to reconcile, I think it was the state of Texas, the state's right to like make its own laws, basically. So they came up with this like trimester framework. So the court does this routinely, which is really, really interesting. You can see it with like the Voting Rights Act. Like the court won't only make decisions, it will come up with like standards and formulas to try to give guidance to individuals and states. Like the Lemon test was this early like qualifier that the court came up with to help states determine if certain speech was protected or not. So some states, when I know I'm changing topics, but I'll come back to abortion. Some states, for instance, continue to have to, less so now, seek permission from the Department of Justice if they're going to change their election laws as a result of the decisions in the 60s by the court to not punish states, but to set states right when it came to their efforts to stop certain people from voting. So they can make decisions, but they can also enforce those decisions and provide legal frameworks by which states have to comply. So in this instance, going back, to the Roe decision, they literally came up, like the court, not a group of experts of women's health or birth at all, came up with like the trimester framework to try to explain this. And so it allowed women within a certain time frame a protected right to an abortion. So what that did was it didn't give women the right to an abortion or the right to seek an abortion or acquire an abortion, but it stopped states from being able to restrict abortion procedures within that framework for a certain amount of time. And I actually don't exactly know. It was definitely the first trimester. And then there are all sorts of caveats and rules around that too. And so states have creatively, for 50 years, a lot of people feel really passionately about this, tried to, within the legal limits, continue to restrict abortion as much as they possibly can. Like one thing that I know Texas was doing, for instance, was like abortion providers had to have, like they were just throwing up legal administrative hurdles to this. Like you have to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital if you're going to perform abortions in the state of Texas, meaning you have to go through all this legal paperwork basically in case something were to go wrong with the abortion and she needs to be rushed to an emergency room at a nearby hospital, So states have been fighting, the Roe decision for a long time. They've been abiding it, but they've been fighting it for a long time. So yeah, it's all grounded in the incorporation of the 14th Amendment, which some of the justices who concurred with the opinion actually said, we should have incorporated the 9th Amendment with this. So there was an incredible debate about Roe at the time, but basically everyone accepted the court's decision begrudgingly and tried to find ways to work around it.
So it was never a right, but they just kind of saw in the Constitution that women can do it within a certain time period, and the states couldn't stop them.
Yeah. We would definitely need to talk to a lawyer about whether it was incorporated as a right. It became a recognized right, I might argue, based on their interpretation of the 14th Amendment. But Supreme Court cases can be overturned.
Right.
And Democrats had an opportunity in the Obama years.
They did.
They had an opportunity to codify this into actual law. The court. The court can make decisions, but when the court goes too far in attempting to write the law, I'm trying to be very careful with my words here, recognition of rights through only the Supreme Court that aren't grounded in actual law, just in case precedent, is always super tenuous.
You're right.
So because the court can undo it, because Congress can pass a law or the Constitution can be amended. So anything that the court decides, and if we're going to call it a right, if abortion was a right that women had from 1973 through 2022, it was always tenuous for 50 years. And there were opportunities where Congress or the people themselves could have amended the Constitution to codify this. Or with Congress, they could have just passed a law as well. And they failed to do so. So the court changed its mind, which it can do. So it rested on the court, and then the court changed its mind.
And what was the reasoning for the overturning? What did
they totally invalidated all the logic. So that 1973 decision was super tenuous. They had to sort of fight their way there. They got there and they agreed on that principle, but all the the dissents at the time pointed out some of the logical, I won't even call it leaps, but the assumptions they were making about the 14th Amendment and this right that they were granting, and so critics for almost 50 years have been resting on that and saying, hey, you got it wrong. And so when we have a favorable slant on the court, when we have enough people that agree with us, and not even politics, but when people see that the logic is actually different, or that I can't see that in the 14th Amendment, we'll just overturn it. It's your example of the executive
executive orders.
Executive order, thank you. I was going to say executive action. It's exactly that for the Supreme Court. So it took 50 years to turn, but when it turned, they instantly look back at the decision and say, that's not true. Right. The dissent was actually right. That logic isn't there. And so now we'll see a couple of different cases that have rested on that logic are now, if they're taken up by the court, will likely change as a result.
And stuff, right? Yeah. And so they just, the Supreme Court justices today just saw the 73 justices' logic of being wrong. So theoretically, Clarence Thomas could say, yeah, abortion's a right, but you're just doing it the wrong way.
Sure.
Right? You went through it the wrong way. If you guys put it through Congress and get an amendment, then it's totally fine. But the logic that you used to get there was not logical.
And we have to remember that the Supreme Court it's always a case. It's always someone suing someone else, right? And so they're looking at a very narrow instance. But that's where all that logic comes into play, right? So it's always bigger than just whether, and people forget this, but it's almost irrelevant how the justices feel about a particular issue. They're looking at the law and then the lawsuit that's in front of them specifically. It often has big ramifications, especially if they're overturning a previous precedent. But it's irrelevant whether Clarence Thomas thinks abortion is correct or moral or amoral. It's all about what the Constitution says and how it can be interpreted, right? And so Alito was very careful. I skimmed through the decision, it's crystal clear that, basically Alito's point is, I can't find the logic for this in the United States Constitution. It's not there currently. If it were amended, it would be there currently, and then it would be clear. If a law were passed, it would be clear. So this is the domain of the states specifically, who are free to expand that right or limit that right.
Yeah. I think people just
they feel a right has been stripped from them for sure.
That was never there, and it's well, you guys were just played.
But it's more complicated than that. Yeah, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and just people you guys can put it in the Constitution. You just gotta get the senators and the House on board. And it's that might be really hard right now, but it's not. I don't know.
I empathize. I really do. Personally, I'm definitely pro-choice. Like I would like the government out of that issue and a million other issues actually. People feel really strongly on the moral side of it, and so it's best with the local government. Like I would argue, like whoever's closest to the people, it would be best there. But I do sympathize with the argument. I think there's something to be said for the other side, which very much argues like if you believe fundamentally that it is and ought to be like a protected right, and if you do feel like you're in the minority, like I always empathize with the minority position.
Right.
So if you can't get Congress to pass a law, and if your state does make it illegal, like the state has taken what might be argued as a natural right from you. Like the state is limiting you by making it illegal to you or inaccessible to you. So I honestly sympathize with the argument, but you have to use the existing structure of government to do it. And you can't rest on a court decision that can be overturned in the same way that you can't rest on an executive order.
Right.
Change the law, right? Change the law.
Yeah. And I wish more people would just realize that. Like,
it's tough, it's hard for me to believe that the Dobbs decision actually came through. Like I never thought I'd see that day. Like I had just recorded a bunch of U.S. history lectures where I talked about Roe. Yeah. Like instantly, and this always happens. I always find this in life. When I do something, things change. Like when the moment I'm more sure that something is sort of set, like that's when it changes.
So don't talk about gay marriage because I don't think our country could handle that. But at the same, like with gay marriage and Roe and like abortion and stuff, I feel like most Americans are pro gay marriage and pro at least like first trimester choice. When you get to like 9 months
you
and
are
stuff,
correct.
like
yes,
I even talked to some of my family members about like abortion and whatnot, and they're like, like they're very passionate pro choice, but it's like once it's like 7, 8, 9 months, it's like that's too much. That's too far. And
that does seem to be where the mainstream is. But I think a lot of and I'm actually surprised we haven't seen a more fervent response to the Dobbs decision.
Oh my gosh, I know.
Because it was unthinkable just a few years ago. But if you believe that like the federal government is going to save you, and like if it's going to be the agent of justice and democracy for you, and the federal government fails you, like that's what's so vexing for so many people right now in this moment is the court is now slanted in a direction that they generally don't support. And so their saviors, i.e. the federal government, the people they want to bring democracy, to nationalize, to unify the United States, that's now under, that option isn't available to them. And so it's scary for folks who think that the solution to a lot of our problems is just greater nationalization, to realize that you can't do that. Like no longer is that door open to you. Like government isn't speaking in one voice any longer.
Right.
You can't reliably trust Congress and the executive to just keep expanding federal power if the Supreme Court is actually saying, the stuff that's been true for 50 years, we don't agree any longer. The reversing trend. And the Supreme Court has done this from time to time. Obviously, composition of the court matters. And, during the 60s, the court really leaned in the other direction, protecting the rights of minorities and all of that. Right. So the court is definitely it's a cycle. It's going through a sort of the opposite cycle currently.
Yeah. And that's what I would say to people, like,